Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar on cattle handling with Professor Temple Grandin. I'm Steve West from AHDB Dairy and I'll introduce you to Temple in just a moment. Let's go through some housekeeping and explain the background to what we have in store for you over the next few weeks on this subject. All of you are muted and this webinar is being recorded so you can share it afterwards. For dairy farmers registered with Dairy Pro, please provide your details in the message box on the right. You can ask questions and only the organisers will see them, so you can ask them in confidence. Now, the question box is on the right. It's the box that opens when you click on the orange arrow. We have around 700 of you listening at this present moment, and there's plenty more coming in. So I am expecting a lot of questions, so please understand if we don't manage to get to yours. But don't let that put you off. We want as many questions as possible and we will put as many as we can to Temple. So this meeting is about cattle. So of course I'm expecting we've got both beef and dairy levy payers listening. There are two more webinars in the series, as you can see just over my left shoulder here. Next week on the 16th of February at the same time we have Neil Chesterton, the dairy vet behind Lame Cow Consultancy in New Zealand, and on the 2nd of March we have Jurp Driesen from Cow Signals in the Netherlands. Now both of these webinars are directed more toward dairy farms, but they'll cover different elements of cattle handling that I know Temple will touch on today. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to record either of those two webinars that are coming up. So you must listen live in order to avoid disappointment. The details are at the top and I'll go through that a little bit more at the end of the webinar today. Now, one of the challenges with any webinar, I think it's a big problem, is that you have a lack of interaction, don't you? And we're offering all dairy farmers who are listening the opportunity to sign up to a focus group with Miriam Parker from Livestock Wise, which will be hosted on Microsoft Teams on the 24th of February. Here you can discuss some of the take-home messages that will come out of today's webinar, and we can of course tailor it to your on-farm environment. Now places are limited to 30 and details of how to book will be added to the chat box a little bit later in this webinar, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on and, as to how to book. Beef farmers, we don't want to leave you out. Any beef farmers who are interested, please do email your details to the same place, register your interest, and we'll try to fulfill what's needed on another suitable date. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that at the end of today, but that's enough from me really. I want to just quickly explain who our speaker is this evening. Professor Temple Grandin of Colorado State University. Now, Temple Grandin is a world-renowned animal behaviourist and designer of cattle handling facilities. Her writings on the flight zone and other principles of grazing behaviour have helped many people to reduce stress on their animals during handling globally. She has appeared in countless primetime US TV programs and publications, including People magazine, New York Times, and Forbes. In fact, Time magazine named Temple as one of the top 100 most influential people in 2010. She has authored over 400 articles and took part in a TED lecture in 2010 entitled "The World Needs All Kinds of Minds." Her life story has also been made into an HBO movie, which I'd certainly recommend. It's entitled Temple Grandin and it stars Claire Danes. Now, this won 7 Emmy Awards and a Golden Globe. In 2017, she was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame, and in 2018, made a fellow by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you this evening, Temple, and I'll hand over to you to take us through your presentation.
Well, it's really great to be here by virtual, absolutely wonderful. And I want to talk to you about stockmanship cattle handling, and there'll be quite a few beef cattle in here, but a lot of the things I talk about are the same for all animals. And I want to go to the next slide, which shows something that appeared on our campus. And the reason why I'm showing this is I want to talk about the importance of becoming a really good observer. Those are eclipse shadows through a tree, and the tree acts like little pinhole cameras. Well, I didn't know eclipses made these weird shadows. I noticed these shadows. I watched probably 100 students walk over this. This was right in front of our library. They didn't see these weird shadows that the eclipse was making. And it's really important for in stockmanship to be a good observer. I know you're going to have cow signals like a talk, and he talks about the importance of observing, you know, the animal's body posture and other things. I'm a visual thinker. Everything I think about is a picture. It's not in words. Animals live in a sensory-based world, not a word-based world. And cattle are very, very sensitive to things they see, little things that move rapidly that might scare them, things that we would tend to not notice, like a little cup on the ground, a paper towel hanging out of a rack. The next slide shows some really, really calm, totally stress-free cattle handling. There's no fear. Now, we talk about animals getting agitated. Well, that's fear. Animals feel fear. Animals definitely do have emotions. There's some no fear. You lead them around with a feed bucket. Now, when you got them that tame, you got to be really careful about their manners. You cannot have these heavy animals pushing and shoving on people. And one of the mistakes that people make is they'll put the feed down when they're pushing and shoving. Then you've rewarded pushing and shoving. So if you're changing pastures, you wait until they stand back a little bit, and then you open the gate. They've got to ask nicely. Now, the next picture shows, I took down in Mexico a lot of years ago. And you get a horse there, going to get really stressed. I think the guy just got his pride hurt. But with the saddle suddenly coming off the horse, and I happen to have the camera either right at the right time or maybe the wrong time, no matter how you want to look at this. But something sudden, like that saddle coming off, that's really scary. That's sudden novelty. And once an animal gets really frightened, it takes 20 to 30 minutes for them to calm back down. So maybe it might be a good time to take a break. But sudden novelty. When I worked in a dairy, one day the cattle were just freaking. They wouldn't come into the milking parlor. And the problem was somebody hung a yellow raincoat up in there that had never been there before. The next slide shows some of the signs of fearful cattle. The first thing they'll do, they'll put their head up, looking all around, ears pinned back. And then the next thing they'll do is they'll start to switch their tails. That's all they'll tell you when they get ready to kick you. And then when they start pooping, they're really scared because you scared the you-know-what out of them. And when you see eye white, though on some of the Holsteins, the way their eyes are made, you can see eye white naturally. But on other breeds of cattle, you see eye white, they are getting scared. And it's sort of like a pot coming to a boil. And then kaboom. You're working with training animals, training a horse, they start to switch their tail. You might want to end the training session before he bucks you off. Now I'm going to show you some lighting things. And this next slide shows going straight into the sun. You've all been out on the motorway where you had to drive directly into the sun, and it was just awful. You might want to change the time of day that you load the trailer so you can avoid going into the sun. Time of day can make a big difference. Another thing that can make a big difference is shadows. My student, Dennis Wilson, just finished up a survey, and he found that when the sun made really sharp shadows of maybe the bars of fences, cattle that had not been in that facility before would balk at it. Now, in a dairy, you might have a drain on the floor. The old cow will just walk right over it, but the new heifer, she's going to stop at it. Give her a chance to look at it. So get down in your facilities and see what they're seeing. And right here, they can see a car parked outside the facility. Vehicles parked along facilities can often be a problem. There's also a little red piece of string. Little things we tend to not notice, they will notice. And in a dairy, the animals that are going to notice this the most are the new heifers. The next slide shows a chain hanging down. Yep, an animal that's first coming in, going to balk at that. Also, objects can change how they look when they change position. Another one of my students, Megan Corrigan, just got finished doing a study with horses where she walked them by a children's play set. And after they got used to walking by it, she rotated it and it became a new object. Think about it. Let's say we had a giant, 3-meter long stapler. This is what it looks like this way, looks different this way. See, when you turn it, it looks different. Well, you have an object that looks different when you turn it, the animal might treat it as a new object. The next slide shows going into a dark building. This can be especially a problem on bright, sunny days. At night, you put lights inside this building, the cows are going to go in there just fine. On a real bright, sunny day, you can have a problem because their eyes have to adjust. I call this the dark movie theater effect. Now, I haven't been to a movie for over a year because of COVID, but you can all remember going in a dark theater and you can't see anything. Well, the animal is the same way. So the next slide shows things that you could do about this. You can put in some translucent panels so they can see some light through the building. If they can see light through the building, they'll go in there more easily. My next slide shows animals stopping at a water puddle on a pasture. And what you need to do here is give that leader a chance to put the head down and take a look at the water. If you push the leader when they've got the head down, they're not going to go. You got to wait for the leader to bring the head back up. Then you push them. And you go, I don't have time for that. Well, you have time for them to turn back on you. Let the leader look at the puddle, and then the leader will go across, and then the other cattle will follow. The next slide shows a backstop gate at the entrance to a chute, and or a race. We'll use the term race. Those cause more problems than they solve because they don't like going through them. So in this situation, you might want to put a remote control rope on that backstop gate so you can hold it open for the cattle and then close it behind them. It's a little remote control rope, really, really simple. The next slide emphasizes the importance of bringing up small groups. This is especially important on, when you're doing vaccinations. People bring too many up, and what I have to find out, whenever I work with beef cattle, is I have to find out what's the correct number to bring up. And people also put too many into the holding pen for the milking parlor too and jam them in there. Good handling is going to require more walking. So I've got this cute little picture of one dog walking the other dog. Because to really do handling well, you're going to need to bring up small groups, and that's going to take more time. People don't want to do the walking. And sometimes people say to me, well, why does Temple Grandin have to keep talking about the same stuff all the time? Because people are still bringing too many up and doing other things that we have to keep talking about. The next slide, I emphasize filling the crowd pen half full. And I find that that's something I have to constantly stay after people about, that to bring the small groups up. Now, the next few slides, I'm going to show flight zone principles. We go to the next slide, big flock of sheep. And you can see how in these animals that are not completely tame, the flight zone makes a bubble. And there's a number of people teaching low stress handling that talk about how to position yourself so that the animals will just flow around the bubble. And the size of that bubble is going to vary. Now, of course, that animal that was so tame that the lady could lay on top of it, that is no flight zone at all. Those you're going to have to lead. But what affects the size of this bubble is amount of contact with people, the genetics of the animal. The more flighty animals will stand further back. Also, the quality of the handling. Is it quiet and low stress, or is it rough? The next slide shows using the bubble concept to move some animals out of a pen. And you can see there how they're just flowing around the bubble. Now, on my website, grandin.com, I got lots of free videos and stuff on grandin.com. I actually have a video of this same slide, and you can see how the cattle walk around the bubble. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this next slide on the flight zone is kind of a busy slide, and I don't have any way of using a pointer, unfortunately, but the dotted curved lines shows a single file race that the animal would walk through. And you've got a point of balance at the shoulder. Now, the big mistake I see people do is stand at the head and poke them on the butt. This is another thing I have to keep talking about, because people still keep making these same mistakes. Now, there was a big survey done in the US and Texas. They went to 39 feed yards, and they looked at how well people handled cattle. And you still had 20 or 30% of the people that stand at the head and poke it on the butt. And you're telling it to go forward and backwards at the same time. Now, the gray area on that represents the flight zone. If you stand inside the flight zone, some animals are going to get kind of excited. And then the dotted line is way out on the very edge of the flight zone. So the next slide, I'm going to be able to show you sort of 3 different zones that are around the animals. These black cattle are moving away. I've penetrated their flight zone. But notice that the tan light-colored animal is looking at me. He knows I'm there. Then you've got some other cattle far away that they don't pay any attention to me. So there's kind of 2 zones. There's the flight zone where they move away, but then there's a zone of influence, a zone of awareness, or a pressure zone. People call it different things, but there's the flight zone where they move away, and then there's the zone of, yeah, I want to look at you. I'm aware that you're there. And they'll tend to turn and look at you and stay just outside the flight zone. The next slide shows a very handy way to get animals to move forward when they're in a single file race. And this is a really good thing to use, and it'll enable you to get rid of a lot of electric prods and other bad things. These diagrams are on my website, grandin.com, just my last name, grandin.com. And what you do is you walk quickly back past the shoulder in the opposite direction of desired movement. Kind of counterintuitive, but it works. You start using this, you'll be amazed at how well you can move cattle and put away some of the driving aids that you shouldn't be using. Now, of course, in the dairy, I don't want to see any electric prods. And the one thing I never want to see is electric prod is someone's primary driving tool. Get them out of your hands. The next slide shows a race that has a solid outer fence so that when people park the vehicles all along there, they don't see the vehicles. Now, if you have an open side on the chute, you have to kind of imagine that the flight zone comes out sort of like a force field. Remember that picture I showed of that bubble? And if you stand in that bubble, when they're in there, they're going to start getting agitated, maybe jump around, maybe start pooping. And you have to stay outside of their flight zone until it's time to move them. You can walk in there, move them, and then back up. I have found in a facility like this where you have an open side, I can draw a line in the dirt. And if I stand inside the line, they start to get agitated or fearful. Back up outside the line, then they stay calm. And the next slide shows why you need to have a solid outer fence. This is a picture I took down in Australia. So that's why the truck looks very different. But as the cattle came up this single file race to get vaccinated, they could see the big truck there. And this feed yard had 2 facilities, exactly the same design. This one, there was a lot of balking and backing up, and the other one worked. But the other facility was inside a building, so the cattle didn't see things. The next slide shows an animal rearing in a single file race. And the reason why that animal's rearing is because the handler is too close. That animal's trying to get away. So what you need to do is back up, get out of the flight zone. The next slide, I just talk about the optimal length for a single file race. I want to have it long enough so I can use some following behavior. So I can put a few animals in there, and following behavior is a really important thing to use. I want to wait until it's almost empty. Then when I bring up the next bunch of cattle, they just go right on in. They go right on in. Now here's another little trick you can try with a piece of cardboard that I show on my next slide. I've got a squeeze chute with open sides, and you're standing there working it, and you put a piece of cardboard there. So an animal coming in with it so they can't see you, that can help. Try experimenting sometimes with pieces of cardboard. Then you find something that works. Then you can put something on there that's a little more permanent than cardboard. Sometimes very simple changes in your facility can make a big difference. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having a non-slip floor. It is just essential. Got to have a non-slip floor.
Temple,
yep.
do you mind if I just ask a question there?
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Got quite a few questions coming in, but just to break that up, in terms of sort of cattle, in terms of emotional behaviour, where do they? I mean, you've shown slides with horses, you've shown slides with sheep. Where do cattle sort of sit in terms of emotional behaviour compared to pigs, horses,
They
dogs?
all have emotional behavior.
Right.
And I'm going to be showing a slide. They'll give you a preview. We'll wait for this. Let me just talk about emotions. There will be a slide that's going to be coming up where I talk about the Panskep emotions. All people and all animals have this. I don't know about earthworms, but
Okay.
sheep,
Okay.
cattle,
We'll stop.
horses, dogs, things like that. You have fear, and when you're handling animals, most of the problems are fear. But another one of the emotions is separation distress. That's a separate emotion. You take the calf away from the mother and they're upset. That's not fear. It's actually a different brain system. So there's two emotions that when you're handling animals, you're going to run into: fear, and that is a proper scientific word. It's been in the neuroscience literature forever. And separation distress. Like you have one lamb separated from the herd, or one dairy cow just got off by herself and she's upset about it. That's separation distress. Now COVID's been really, really good for animals. But now one of my friends got a really nice dog and she got a job. The dog was home alone. It chewed up her pajamas. That was yesterday. That was separation distress. It was certainly not fear. And they are scientifically, fear and separation distress are two separate emotional systems, and they're both negative. They're definitely not positive emotions. And when I get to the emotions slide, I will go into some of the positive emotions. But animals have emotions. There's no question about that.
Well, I'll hold on to that question then until that moment, and I'll let you continue, Temple.
You want to go on some other question? You said you had a bunch of questions. I can't see questions, so
I'll ask you another quick one then while we're at it. Right. Let's just, so you've talked about a leader cow, the cow that needed to see the water, the puddle.
Yeah.
How do you recognize the leader cow?
Well, the leader cow and the dominant cow at the feed trough are not the same cow. The leader cow, and this gets into emotions, is kind of a low fear, bold cow that likes to explore. So there's another one of the Jack Panskep emotions, which is seek. And there's actually been research done in cattle where GPS collars were put on cattle. This was out in New Mexico, in the state of New Mexico, on really rough range. And some cows would go out and graze a lot of pasture, and others were lazy and lay around the water hole. So that's going to be a high seek and a low seek. And that leader tends to be, likes to explore, probably lower fear. Now, if the herd gets attacked by wolves or dogs or some other predator, that dominant cow at the feed trough, she will be in the center of the herd where she's protected. The dominant cow does not lead the herd across something like water. She's going to let somebody else do that. I mean, think about the wildebeest herds in Africa. Well, the dominant cow is going to let the crocodiles or the alligators or whatever get somebody else.
I see. No, that's tremendous. I've got a few more questions, but I'm going to hold on to those, Temple, because I know what's coming later on. So I'll leave you to continue some more slides.
All right, let's do a few more slides. Now, this was a study in Brazil. And she did some simple improvements on their corrals, the cardboard that I showed you. Also, simple changes in the cattle handling. No yelling and screaming. Yelling and screaming at cattle is very stressful. It has intent. They know you're mad at them, where something like a hydraulic pump running doesn't have intent. I want to get rid of dogs around the chutes, and she got rid of electric prods, and the stress hormone, the cortisol stress hormone was significantly reduced. And another thing is non-slip flooring. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. Now let's go on to the next slide, because we're going to get into now talking about some facility things. And when I first started in the industry in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of our cattle were extremely wild. And in the last 20 years in beef cattle in the US, there's been a lot of selection for calmer temperament. A lot of the cattle we have now do not get scared as easily as some of the cattle we had 20 years ago. So I used to put solid sides on just everything. But now that we've calmed some of these animals down, and in dairies, you can have a facility with an open side, but it's going to require more stockmanship skill. And I would strongly recommend covering the outer perimeters. And most of these places have buildings around them with walls on them. So that acts as a solid outer wall. But you have to respect that flight zone. That kind of will be like a force field that's going to come out through the fence. And it requires more skill. The next slide shows some curve systems that I have designed. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of correct layout. This is shown on my website. Has to be laid out correctly. Now, cattle in shape have a natural tendency to want to go back to where they came from. That's one of the reasons why curved chute works, because they go on around back to where they come from. Another reason why it works is when they enter that single file, they can't see the people standing around with the vaccinating stuff. Let's go to the next slide. This is a really important slide, and it shows the right way and the wrong way to lay out a curved facility. And if you build it according to that dotted line, it will not work. It's got to be laid out correctly. And the radius or the size of the gate for the crowd pen, I like one that's 3.5 meters or 12 feet. You can go down to 3 meters or 10 feet. Do not make them smaller than 3 meters. And these crowd pens laid out in a full half circle. So they come on around and they go back to where they came from. The next slide shows a very simple little curved facility. A lot of people have been asking me to come up with some things that are less expensive. This layout's on my website. It's also my book, Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals, which is available electronically on Amazon and other sites. But the way this works is you stand at the pivot of the crowd gate, and you put the crowd gate on the first notch, and then the cattle just come on around you, and you're not on the catwalks. I'm 73 years old now. I have a hard time getting on and off those catwalks. And I really like this. I call it working the pivot. And there's a lot more information on this in Grandin.com. Another thing that's nice about this layout is a lot of buildings have a series of poles to hold up the roof. And it's very easy to put this design in and have the poles go down the middle part of it, so you don't have to modify the building. Again, solid outer side, and then a partially open inner side. Now, I'd rather put a solid side at least this far up on the bottom. I want to keep their feet inside of it. I'd recommend that. The next slide shows another simple design where you can work the pivot. It's also on my website, and you work that whole inner part of that. And the solid black line is a solid outer fence. But again, you've got to respect that flight zone that's extending out there and only enter it when you want to move them. Now, a lot of people ask me all the time about the Budbox. And this is something that's very, very simple to build. It's on the next slide. Very simple to build, but now that's gotten, the slide's been compressed. I want to tell you right now, the Budbox is not a square. The computer has compressed this slide for some reason. My books have got, the diagram of this done correctly. It's a rectangle, but you still are using the same principle of going back to where they come from. Now, this is an example of a design that's very economical to build, but it requires more stockmanship skill, especially if you're in there with them. You also absolutely cannot overfill it. You don't store cattle in it, and you don't overfill it. You bring them in the back gate, you step through the back gate, and they circle around you. Remember how I showed you that bubble earlier? And they fill up the single file chute. And what you put in the box has to fit in the chute. You don't want one left over going crazy, because then you're going to get the separation distress problem, and that can get dangerous. And you don't store cattle in this. It does take more skill to use, but it's very, very, very economical to build. You can make it out of portable panels. And we'll go on to the next slide. How about driving aids? Now, there's some people now working on low stress handling that recommend out in the pastures and places like this, you don't even need driving aids. And one of the reasons why they recommend this is because people just can't stop doing this. And so they'll get them out there and have them, their hands at their side and just use slight positions of their body. Now, one place where I like a flag like that is where you can reach into a crowd pen from the outside and you turn an animal and not have to be in there with them. But you want to use it just slightly like this, not flapping. People seem to have a natural instinct to want to flap their arms. The next slide shows a survey that was done in the US, and they found that in places where they used electric prods all the time, you had a lot more stumbling, vocalization, a lot of handling problems. Another thing that showed up in this survey is they had a lot of problems with vocalization and hydraulic squeeze chutes, and that's because they got the pressure too tight. You need to adjust hydraulic restraint equipment so that it automatically stops squeezing at a reasonable pressure. If an animal vocalizes when you squeeze it, you're hurting it. You need to put less pressure on it. The next slide just shows some more, curved facilities, and I'm emphasizing about keeping the outer perimeter solid. And the next slide, I just talk about design concepts. There's kind of two ways that I can design things. I can do something very simple, like the Budbox, very economical, but requires more skill. Or I can do one of my curved facilities, a little more expensive, but they're easier for less skilled people to use, and the people are not in with the cattle. The next slide, I discuss some behavioral principles of restraint. I already talked about non-slip flooring. Optimal pressure, you got to hold it tight enough so it feels held. If you're using a squeeze chute where it squeezes, you've got to make sure you don't throw your animal off balance. If you throw it off balance, it's going to start to get scared. And then that piece of cardboard that I showed over the side of the chute, that's an example of something very simple I did, and it made the cattle come in more easily. And I'd experiment sometimes with pieces of cardboard because it can be a vehicle, or I've seen cars going by on the road will cause balking. The next slide shows a really nice non-slip floor. We've already talked a lot about that, but now I want to test your power of observation. Now, I don't have any way of knowing if 887 people out there when they raise their hands, but if I was doing it live, I would ask you, raise your hand if you noticed when I first put this slide up here that that animal was looking at the sunbeam. Now it's obvious, I've told you. When I chose children this slide, over half of them will notice this. But this is the sort of stuff that would make a new heifer balk and refuse to move in the milking parlor. Where if you had a sunbeam like this, the old cows will just walk over it. They've learned that that's not going to hurt them. I was wondering, I just saw you come up on the video. Do you have a question?
I will ask one actually, because it is related to this. So what would you recommend as a non-slip flooring? I see she's got a mat to step onto.
There's a lot of different non-slip flooring options. That's a mat that will not be available in the UK. And now we've got a new company called Animat now at home that sell different mats. There's a lot of different things available. On my website, I show grooved concrete. The steel rods, we still have to use that in some places because it's all they can get. You could even just use sand. Now, we had a nice discussion about corrective actions in our meat plants, and I might use sand at a meat plant to fix an icy loading ramp that day, but I don't want to be putting sand on that loading ramp all the time. I'm going to have to put a better thing on it than sand. So sand might be a short-term corrective action, but a rubber mat might be a long-term corrective action. There's a lot of different things. And one of the simplest things you can do is simply score slipping and falling. If you've got animals slipping and you've got animals falling, you've either got a slippery floor problem, you're getting them too excited, or maybe they're lame. So those are three things that you would need to fix. And the next slide shows handling scoring. And I like this data that was collected at some of our large beef feed yards. Now, electric pride use, I want that really low. But you have a lot of animals slipping and falling or stumbling That's going down and one knee going down on the ground, or miscaught, vocalizing when you restrain them. You've got things that you need to fix. Now, this was done with beef cattle. Now, right now, we're getting beef cattle bigger and bigger, heavier at a younger age, breeding more for meat, and we've been getting heart attack problems, and we've been getting leg and foot problems. I think we have to be careful how much we push animals for productivity. We got to start looking at what's optimal, because I got to have an animal I can handle. And if I got an animal that's leg problems, that can make it very difficult to handle it. It's not going to want to walk because it's sore. Now, I want to just tell you one little thing. Normal cattle lay like this. When they lay on their chest or on the sternum, they lay like this on the sternum. If one leg is sticking out like this, they are sore, because this is the normal way when they rest on their chest or their sternum. And if they're dog sitting with their butt on the ground and their two front legs like this, they're really sore. And that applies to shape too. And I've been seeing more problems with lameness. It's just, it's a variety of factors causing it. And when I did my Improving Animal Welfare, a Practical Approach 3rd edition book, which incidentally has just come out, Improving Animal Welfare, a Practical Approach 3rd edition, published by Cabby in the UK. I looked up the lameness statistics for the UK, and I have bad news. It's not improved very much. We still have to do a lot more work on this. And if you measure lameness, then you see it. If you don't measure it, you tend to underestimate it. Let's go on to the next slide. And that shows some very first work that we did on cattle temperament. And an animal that rated a number 4 was an animal that got extremely fearful and agitated in the squeeze chute when we restrained it. And it had lower weight gains. And when we did this 25 years ago, this was radical stuff. This has been replicated a whole bunch of times. Animal temperament matters. The next slide shows the core emotional systems. This is the Jack Penskep emotional systems. Already talked about fear. Then you have anger. Usually that's not the problem with cattle, except the bull. You go out in the pasture and the bull comes after you. That's not fear. In fact, the worst bull for going after people is that orphan hand-reared pet. Because when he grows up and he's got to prove he's the big man of the herd, he does it on people, usually men, with very, very tragic, bad results. So orphan bull calves, get them in with a group of other cattle. They got to grow up knowing that they are cattle. And then you have seek, I already discussed that. And then, of course, you've got sex drive. And you've got mother-young nurturing and caring. You've got that licking the calf. And then you've got play. And these are scientifically, determined emotional systems. Both genetics and experience affects these. An animal with high fear genetics, I don't care whether it's a horse, a dog, any kind of an animal, if you suddenly introduce novelty, like an umbrella opening, animal with a flighty genetics will have a bigger reaction than the animal with the calmer genetics. The next slide shows a really nice purebred Brahmin. These actually have if you treat them right, they really like stroking by people. I'll give you a little hint. Don't pat animals like this. Stroke it. Stroke it. Make it feel like the mother's tongue. The next slide shows cortisol levels during restraint. And what I want to get across in this slide is that when you just force animals to do stuff, it really stresses them. And when animals are trained to cooperate, like dairy cows are, then you don't get the fear stress. And when you force them, you get all kinds of fear stress. Stockmanship matters. Let's go to the next slide. It's really important that a heifer's first experience with something new, like the milking room, is a good first experience. Because if its first experience is falling on her butt, you might have problems. So first experiences with new people, new equipment like milking room, and new vehicles like a trailer need to be good first experiences. And there's been some work on acclimating heifers to the milking parlor, but one of the mistakes they made is they didn't fade them. All the robot milking now, they feed them. Biggest mistake we made this back in the 80s in the US, was taking feed out of the milking parlor. You know what's happening? People are learning they need to put it back in. There's sometimes that the young students are coming in now and they're going to reinvent something that we should have never have taken out. Let's go to the next slide. I can't emphasize the importance of stockmanship. There's all kinds of research, both old research and new research, that shows that good stockmanship really pays. And Miriam Parker is an excellent stock person. You're going to be hearing from her. She would agree with me on this. Stockmanship doesn't get enough credit. Go on to the next slide. Now, the thing about a new thing is if I take something like a camera box or a tripod and I put it out in the middle of the pasture, the cattle come up to it. So novelty is attractive when they can voluntarily approach it, and it's scary if you just suddenly shove it in their face. And so one of the best ways to introduce animals to new things is to let them approach it. And I get asked all the time, well, my heifer was good at home, and when I showed her at the show, she went berserk. Well, let's get her used to some of the things at the show, like flags, bikes, and balloons. The next slide just shows an umbrella and a canvas. And if you train a cow to tolerate the umbrella, that doesn't transfer to the tarp or the canvas. They're totally different things, and they look completely different. Let's go to the next slide. Dogs around the working area, I just cannot stand them. Now, I've seen really good dogs out in the field, the border collie type of dogs in the field, but around where I'm going to be vaccinating them, it just makes the animals crazy. The next slide, I just talk about the importance of acclimating animals to different people, different vehicles, because some of the worst cattle to go berserk when they go somewhere new are the ones that have lived too sheltered a life, and they've only seen one farmer and one truck, and they haven't seen anything else new. You take them to a new place and they get completely scared. Let's go to the next slide. You manage things that you measure. We can measure handling. We can also measure things like lameness, body condition. I've got a student right now working on udder edema, which is a non-infectious swelling of the udder. This is another problem that's creeping up on us. So we get more and more high-producing cows, and this occurs where there's no infection, but you'll kick the milker off. And my student owns a dairy, and that's one of the reasons why she decided to study this. And a lot of people don't even realize that it exists. You measure things, it prevents bad from becoming normal. And I think lameness is one of those things where bad became normal. Now, this just shows how I made some changes in some handling equipment, and I reduced the vocalization. On the big bar graph there, I reduced pressure on the neck applied by a head stanchion. And when I did this, then the mooing went away. I put a light on an entrance because they didn't want to go into that dark movie theater. And then less cattle were vocalizing because they weren't poking them with electric prods. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is McDonald's audits that I did in the US, and we scored meatpacking plants on their performance. And when I first started and collected baseline data for the USDA, captive bolt stunning was atrocious because the equipment was broken. And then when you had big buyers looking at this, then things got a whole lot better. A whole lot better. And a lot of the things that we did to improve the handling scores, vocalization, slipping and falling, a lot of non-slip flooring, a lot of training, a lot of very, very simple things. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there's kind of three different types of animal welfare standards. And the tendency now is to go with what's called an animal-based outcome standard. Lameness would be that. Slipping and falling is an outcome standard. I'm not going to tell you how to build a floor, but I can measure slipping and falling. And I'll tell you one thing that does not work. Just a little bit of a rough broom finish on concrete does not work. That gets slick. And the OIE is going to be going more towards outcome-based variables. And I know that EFSA and the EU are going more towards outcome-based variables. Some of this has been delayed by COVID. Then you have some practices you just forbid. I do a lot of work with large customers, and we've got to have some very clear thou shalt nots. And if you do these thou shalt nots, then you may not be a supplier any longer. And getting away from input measures like telling you exactly how to build a cubicle in a barn for a cow to lay in. Now, if there's something wrong with that cubicle, then she's likely to be dirty or have swollen joints or be lame. Let's go to the next slide. Now, here are some of the critical control points for cattle welfare. Handling, scoring. That's going to be one of them. Swollen leg joints, lameness, filthy, dirty animals. Embedded pack systems, we've got to make sure you put enough bedding in there so your animals stay clean. Body condition, ammonia levels, you just about have to measure that with a meter. But everything's an outcome measure there except the ammonia measure. Heat stress, if cattle at rest breathe with their mouth open, they are too hot, period. And coat condition. We've been using that in organic operations, where people get too accustomed to looking at lice and stuff like that and thinking that's normal. No, that's not normal. So you're going to need to have a nice coat on your animals. These are very, very easy things to look at. So what are kind of the steps for improving animal welfare? The first thing I got to do to improve it is I got to make sure no acts of abuse are going on. Now the animal activists are getting into more and more places. And what they just did, they just recently got into a chicken growing place, and they showed us pictures of, little chicks that were having problems. They were having a harder and harder time actually finding something wrong with the grower. Implementing scoring. And then in cattle, we don't really have to worry too much about behavior needs in dairy cattle. This is a bigger problem in the laying hen and in the pegs. And do animals have positive emotions? I'll tell you how to find some positive emotions in dairy cattle. Go on to YouTube and look up a cow motorized grooming brush. And I'm not supposed to say as a scientist that cows love these brushes, but when you watch these videos, they obviously love these brushes. And they'll line up and wait to use it. So that's positive emotions. So it's not enough just to prevent abuse or to prevent suffering. We also have to look at it and go, are we giving those animals a good life? This is the 5 domains from David Malore, which has a lot of similarities to welfare quality. And he's added, the importance of looking at, does the animal have a life worth living? Have some time to have some experiences of things it would like to do. And I think I got one last slide. And that's my website, grandin.com. Everything on that is free. And we are now open up for questions. And we got over half an hour for questions.
That's fantastic. That's the fantastic pace of those slides too. So thank you, Temple. I think we've covered a lot of ground there in just those few minutes. But we have had a lot of questions. The word in the UK, of course, is TB. Those 2 words. TB testing. How could we make that a less stressful scenario? So if you can imagine the vets up at the head end of the animal, they are clipping in one particular area and injecting 2 inoculants.
Well,
how could we make that?
Trained to procedures, and that's probably not. You're not going to train them for really painful procedures. The worst cattle I ever saw to get them into a facility were some where too many students had palpated them, and you could not get them out of the crowd pen. Worst cattle, worse than anything I've seen at the slaughterhouse. They were the worst. But something that's just a bit uncomfortable and painful, they can get acclimated to it. Feed them a reward when they come out. Feed them a reward. They're doing that in Brazil right now with a really flighty Nalor cattle. Mateus Lacosta's doing that. Give them a reward. See, it goes back to, why did we take feeding out of the milking parlor? I thought it was the stupidest thing we ever did. Because there's a study that was done where they tried to acclimate heifers just running through there before they started milking, and the more flighty heifers got stressed. You feed them in there. No, you come out of there and you're going to get you get a half a coffee cup of some delicious grain. It's a treat that you're not normally allowed to have.
No,
That's a whole lot on that. But you have to use something that they've learned from experience is a treat. Boy, I can tell you, for our cattle, it's a thing I call Cooner flakes. It comes from the local feed yard. In one of my labs, I couldn't figure out why we couldn't get the cattle to leave the cattle handling building. They kept turning to the right. There was a big bucket of Cooner flakes over there I didn't know about. And they were smelling them. They wanted them. They didn't care how many students were in that cattle handling barn. Cooner flakes are just so yummy. That's the name of a local feed yard.
Now, when you say it, it seems so clear, because we do it with our dogs, don't we? So we could easily give them the last treat, I think.
Well, let's just start giving them some treats, and because that's not going to be a painful procedure like too many students doing palpation. And it happened about 15 years ago, and that professor no longer works here. But they were in one of my labs 15. They were the worst cattle, and you couldn't get them in single file. I had to have 3 of the guys push them in. They would not go. But the TB thing isn't that, it's a Cripple clippers are a bit scary, and I'm.
But we can acclimatize.
It's an uncomfortable procedure, but.
I see. So actually, there's a question related to that. It's about negative experiences for that animal. Like you touched on it when you were saying about make sure you run heifers through the milking parlor, get them used to it without any negative experiences. And I'm assuming this could be included in that. So how do you stop cattle from bulking at the head yoke? So in a new handling setup.
The cattle, some of the worst cattle for balking at the head yoke are ones that have been bashed on the head by it. I actually did a little study on that. We had some bulls that we had to work every 30 days. So I went down and I kept track of who got accidentally hit with the head holder. And the ones that got hit with the head holder, they'd go in the squeezing part and they'd come up the head holder and they're going like this. They remembered. And the other thing that's just so important, I want animals walking up the head yoke, not running. And I just been doing my class, and I've been getting a lot of discussion on the discussion board about animals hitting the head gate or the head yoke too hard. Well, bring them in quietly. This is where the person who's working the back end is important. You have a bunch of yelling and screaming, and then they're going to come in there fast. I want them walking in.
No, I see. No, well, so I mean, related to that, I mean, we've spoken about wild cattle or cattle that perhaps would go a bit too quick into the head yoke. What about
tame cattle? If you bang them on the head with it hard, they're going to remember that. Because the thing that was interesting, the animal knew exactly which part of that restraint apparatus was bad, and they went into the squeezing part fine, but this part here, instead of getting them here, had got them here. And they remembered that. I call it nutcrackering them. They got bashed here and they remembered.
Yeah, no, I can believe it. I think we've all seen it, and it's never pleasant. But the other end of the spectrum, if you've got a herd of dairy cows and perhaps you think they're too quiet, they're difficult, you can never get them to move anywhere. Is that a problem? Is that a bad thing?
Well, then there's a point where you got to use feed to move them. And they'll go in there if they're going to get fed. And then in the 70s, one of the big innovations we had was the dairy cow didn't want to leave the stall. So they had these things called automatic feed bowl covers, that where a little gate would swing over and cover up the feed bowl to get her to leave. And then in the 80s, they just took it all out. And now I think we're realizing that this was a mistake, because when the robotic milking came in, that's all got feed in it.
No, I see. No, well, you often see it, don't you? I know when we've spoken in the past on the lead up to this webinar, we were talking about what characteristics are best for people who are working with animals. What characteristics would you say make the best stock people?
Well, a calm person. There's an old study that was done years ago by a guy named Seabrook, and he found the confident introvert made one of the best dairy stock people. And sort of happy Charlie, kind of excited, you know, wasn't so good. But some people just have a real way with animals. Also, there is a confidence. If you're afraid of them, they pick up, but you kind of approach them with a confidence. They pick up on that. They're very sensitive to body language and no, but some people are much better stock people than others. And there's a professor here, a new professor named Courtney Daigle at Texas A&M University, and one thing she's working on is try to improve the status of the stock people. It's not just a job for flunkies.
No.
You know, now I've been in this industry for a long time, and there's some places that are raising the status and the pay of a really good stock person, because stockmanship matters. What I have learned is when I was out there selling equipment all over the place, I found it was easy to sell equipment. People want the thing more than they want the management. And I put a lot of equipment out there, and some of my clients tore it up and wrecked it because they thought they could save everything. They could just buy capital investments that would solve their problems magically. I don't care if it's equipment, whether it's computers, or drugs, you know, whatever. And getting people to manage things right, it's hard. And then when I started working with the McDonald's audits in the meat plants, what we did there is we forced them to manage them, because most of the stuff we did was simple things like flooring, lighting, smaller groups, training. And only 3 out of 75 plants had to build something expensive. And 3 plant managers had to go. And after those places got their managerectomy, things greatly improved. And that is strictly management.
I see. Yeah.
When I first started in the 70s, I used to think I could build self-managing cattle handling facilities. That is rubbish.
Yes.
So management's got to get behind things. Also, we cannot understaff and overwork. If people get too tired, and there's been some industry data that's never been published in chickens and in pigs, that after 6 hours spending loading these animals out, people got tired and the deaths went up.
Oh, I see. No, I can believe it. Yeah, I think it's a common problem, and we never give ourselves enough time to do some of these jobs as well. You always think it's going to be a quick job, but it ends up being more difficult.
Well, it's the old thing, slow is faster.
Yes.
And the other thing is, slow is you're less likely to end up in the hospital too, or get an animal hurt.
Yeah. Yes. So another question here about the Budbox. I'm really interested to see that. Gordy Jones spoke about that when he was over several years back, and I've seen it really successfully used. But do you ever get the problem where cows become acclimated to using that same handling system, that same Budbox, and therefore they say, "Oh well, I know this drill. I'm not going to play anymore."
One place where a Budbox doesn't work very well is when you've got cattle that absolutely don't want to go in there, like a hospital where you've had a beef feed yard hospital, because you've got to make the Budbox really work right. You've got to have some flight zone a little bit, so you get that circling around you. The other thing is you absolutely cannot store cattle in it. What you put in the box must immediately turn around and fill up the lead up race with no leftovers. That's really, really important. That's why some people use those double alleys, because you use it right, it's going to force you to have better stockmanship, because it won't work at all if you don't use it right. Now, that other little layout I showed where you come on around, that is that kind of does some of the same things as the Budbox does, where you stand at the pivot point of the single file. Shoot, let's see, maybe I just hold this up here, one of my books right here. I don't know how well you can see this, but this little layout right here, you stand at the pivot point of the crowd gate, And you kind of do some sort of the same thing as the Budbox, not in there with them. And then if you need to, I like to put the crowd gate on the first notch and just leave it there.
I see.
You know,
I see.
and that, but you cannot overfill a Budbox. And I mean, if 5 cattle fit in your lead up race, that's how many you put in the Budbox. You don't put 6 in the Budbox and have a leftover.
I'm with you. No, I think it makes complete sense.
And you have to have a man gate so that you can get out of there easily. A little small like gate for a person. And
Absolutely.
then that back gate that you shut, the back crowd gate, regardless of the design, should be solid.
Perfect.
And these designs are you know, they're in this, and then they're in my guide to working with farm animals.
And it's quicker.
There's a lot of drawings online where that's wrong, and I don't know what the computer did to that diagram of the Budbox, but it's not the square. Somehow compressed it. It didn't do it to the other slides.
No, I think that's okay. I think it just went wrong with that picture, but I think we've got pictures and they're on this website of yours as well, and we can.
Well, and they're in here. I've got one in here that's show you one that's laid out correctly. Because, okay, here's a Budbox that's laid out correctly. Yeah, this image is like kind of backwards. There it is, laid out correctly.
I see. I see.
And then the curve facilities have to be laid out correctly.
No, definitely. I think
there's a lot of drawings that people have put online that aren't to scale either. These drawings in Guide to Working with Farm Animals are to scale.
I see. I see. So thank you for that. I think we've covered some of the cattle handling points. Do you have any thoughts on whistling to move cattle? I mean, you often see that used with both dairy and beef cattle.
Oh, I'd rather not do it. You know, I'd rather just be really quiet, maybe a little. And I had to stop one of my students from doing that with our beef cattle because it got them too hot. I think we need to try to get away from noise coming out of our mouths as much as we can. I'm not going to say never do it, but most of the time you don't need to do that.
No, I understand. Yeah, there's a difference between walking between some dairy cows and talking to them so they know you're there.
Well, talking to them, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. But all the arm waving, yelling, you know, when you whistle at them, all the heads come up, the ears go up, and you know, people question whether you really need to do that.
There is a question about kicking cattle, or not us kicking the cattle kicking us. How can you stop a cow kicking you when you walk past?
She's just when you walk past, she's kicking you?
Yes.
Well, then there's a point where you have to decide you're going to keep that cow or not. Just one cow, and she kicks at you. See, and there may be something in her past that she doesn't like you. Now, I mentioned the udder edema. That can make the udder sore, and there can be no mastitis present, and they might kick at you because they're sore.
Yes, yeah, and you mentioned
by them and kicking at you. See, this is why in troubleshooting behavior problems, I got to know exactly where the kicking is taking place. Because walking by kicking at you is something totally different than kicking a milker off.
Absolutely. No, I think you do occasionally get a rogue animal that will do it, but you spoke about dogs earlier.
Oh, dogs train cattle to kick. You get cattle in a single file race and a dog biting it, that will train them to kick you. This is one of the reasons why I don't like dogs, and even train you to kick with both back feet. And I've had beef cattle almost twice kill me that have been bitten by dogs, and both back feet came flying up. And one of those feet got a guy's hat and flipped it up in the air.
Yeah, it's happened to me.
Border collie out in the field working the flight zone really nice. I'm fine with that. That's good. I've seen that. But dogs biting cattle where they can't get away, all it does is teach them to kick. And then I might have to get rid of the cows. He's just too dangerous.
Absolutely. No, I can see what you mean. It's happened to me as well. We've spoken quite a lot about cows. I'm getting a few questions about calves. One of the problems with a calf is one of the first times you handle it, you put a tag in its ear. It's a negative experience. How can we make that first experience of being handled more positive?
If you do it the day it's born, that calf is so young it may not remember. Now, once it gets to be a month old, it's going to remember. But when it's first born, I don't think they remember. I get asked that question all the time.
Okay, and so with that in mind, is there any difference in the way that you might handle calves up to 4 months old compared to handling cattle, or are they just mini cattle?
Well, if they're 4 months old, they're starting to turn into mini cattle. Now, real little calves, now calves a month old is going to remember stuff. But when you're doing it, right when they're born, I don't think they remember it. And I've been asked that question a whole lot. Now, there has been some research on dehorning with a pain relief, and the research is very clear. It reduces the stress hormones and it reduces pain-related behaviors. And another problem you've got with cattle, since they're a prey species animal, they tend to cover up the fact that they hurt if they know you're watching.
Yes.
Unless they really trust the stock person. If they really trust the stock person, then they may show you they're hurting. But I saw a situation one time where I hid in a scale house, and they were castrating some bulls, and they were rolling around on the ground moaning. And when I come out of that scale house, they jumped up and acted normal. They didn't know I was in the scale house. So I went in there before they brought the cattle up. But if sheep are really bad about this. That's why people say, fine today, dead tomorrow.
Yes.
Because they cover up they're a prey species animal. They don't want to tell a potential predator that they're hurting. And so they see you coming, they a lot of times cover it up. Now, of course, some of these lame dairy cattle can't cover it up, but these animals, I was shocked at how moaning on the ground jumped up and acted normal.
No, I think it's clear to see. We often see it, and of course, when you push them, apply some pressure, that slight lameness disappears. They walk on.
Slight lameness will disappear. Yeah, that's right.
So I'm still getting plenty of questions about handling systems. There's a question about self-locking yokes. There's a guillotine yoke and a self-locking yoke.
We have the same thing.
Do you prefer a self-locking yoke?
Some of this is personal preference on these yokes, but it's really important on a self-locking to adjust it correctly so that it doesn't pinch too tight on the neck. If for really wild beef cattle, I probably wouldn't use one of those. And then some people will just work it manually. The bottom line is I want to make sure that I don't bash them with the thing. And the thing another thing you got to be careful on self-locking is if you adjust it too wide, you can then get it locked like with one leg across here like that, and that's a terrible mess. And they're going to remember that. Some of this is personal preference. There's a lot of different latches on these devices, and you can have ratchet latches. They're noisy, but they don't come undone. Then there's some other types of latches that work with just friction. You never oil those. And some of these latching mechanisms, if they get worn, you need to replace them. Because when they all of a sudden open up suddenly, levers go flying and people end up, their teeth knocked out and end up in the hospital. So keeping those latching mechanisms maintained really important.
No, you can see that certainly, even just from a health and safety perspective for the users. There is a question about walking platforms on the outside of chutes. I know I've often seen these in larger beef type systems. Yeah. Do you have any views on those? Is that a positive or a negative?
Well, there's a tendency now on some of the facilities that I would put that on the crowd pen, but on the single file, what a lot of people are doing now, solid on the outside. Most of the cattle in the UK and in Ireland are going to be not as wild as some of the cattle we may have on far western ranges. And no walking platform along the single file race. You just work that on the ground. And then this diagram that I showed you with the where you work the pivot on this little diagram right here, there's no this is backwards to zoom. That's why I'm having a hard time positioning it. There's no walking platform on this except one little place where you might step on a little platform right where the pivot point is, because I don't want you putting your hand through the bars, because an animal can go and break your forearm. I want you reaching over the bars, but that would just be a little step up place.
I see. Yeah, so you can.
And now there's other places in big meat plants, I'm going to have walking platforms. You see, this is where different things work well in different places.
See, absolutely. So you can manipulate the flight zone much more easily from inside the handling facility without having to step up.
Yeah, that's right. But I want the outer side all closed in, either with a building wall. One of the worst things to mess up handling is to park the vehicles alongside something with open sides. That does not work very well.
I see. So
that doesn't work at all. But like on our facility, we have a walking platform and solid sides on the round crowd pen, and then along the single file, you can work that on the ground. And one of the things I have to show the students is don't stand up there on top of that thing, right up close to those cattle, because they're going to get nervous because you're inside their flight zone. And it's amazing. You've got a chute that's got an open side on it. I can back up like a meter or 1.5 meters and they calm right down. And then I step forward too much, I start seeing them jumping around and start doing some pooping and flipping their tails around.
Okay, no, I see. There is a question.
Packing plants, I'm going to just make it solid. You've got too much commotion going around, put walking platforms on it. There's just too much activity usually in a packing plant. I've
got a question about turning left or turning right. Okay, and it's not about so do cows prefer to go left or right? Is that a myth or is that true?
I think the most important thing is if you have two facilities on your property, make sure they both turn in the same direction. Now, there has been some research on laterality. Remember when you studied high school biology, your eye optic tracts cross. So your right eye goes to your left brain, and your left eye goes to your right brain. And the old thing about right brain, left brain people, well, there's some of this in cattle. And the right brain is the side of the brain that like looks for scary stuff and things that might be bad. And the left brain, sort of more the seek. So when they're kind of afraid of something, they'll use the left eye going to the right brain. And now I think if you got really tame cattle and you've really worked on them, I think learning will override most of that. But there was a study done on dairy cattle where they put a man in the exit alley of the milking shed, and the ones that were flighty tended to go by him so they could watch him with the left eye because maybe he was bad.
I see.
Yeah, it's called eye laterality. Actually, if you're interested, and I do have a little bit of stuff on this in Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals. If you're interested in looking that stuff up, you can go on Google Scholar and just type in cattle eye laterality, those 3 key words. But I'm not going to, as of right now, redo every cattle handling facility over this. No. You know, in the practical world, if you have two, I tell ranchers, if you're going to have 2 corrals on your ranch, let's have them both work the same way, because animals learn the path through it. I don't want it going totally different, opposite direction in one corral.
Okay, no, I see. No, that's perfect. Thank you. I've got some more questions here about I've lost my train of thought there for a moment. I'll ask you this question about people. So why do we have to keep reinforcing these messages? You've been doing this now for a number of years, and we still have to repeat the same messages.
I think it's a lot like traffic. The police still have to have speed cameras and be monitoring speed and monitoring drunk driving and monitoring stopping violations. I think it's kind of the same thing. What I have found in training people on livestock handling is you've got a few people, they are the superb stock person. I mean, someone like Miriam Parker. Then you've got other people where you constantly have to keep kind of, it's sort of like the police have to constantly monitor the speed. And then there's a few people that I don't think should be handling livestock. They like to be mean to them. And when we worked on those McDonald's audits, it was now 1999, over 20 years ago, had to get rid of 10% of the people. They just would not put the electric prod away. Then they went to video auditing, and another round of people were gotten rid of because they just would keep poking them with the electric prodder and doing rough things to them.
I see.
But I find that they did this survey in Texas, 39 feed yards, 2 years ago. There was a survey done, and they found about 60 or 70% of the people were doing things right. That's good. That's a lot better than it would have been 20 years ago or 10 years ago, because our cattle association has done lots and lots of low stress handling workshops and lots of stuff on beef quality assurance, training people. So that's the good news. But there's still 20 or 30% that stand in front of the head and poke the butt and put too many cattle in the crowd pen and yell at cattle and bang the side of the facility with a stick.
I see.
We still, and people, then I've had people that are new going into the industry, oh, Dr. Grandin, she just talks about the same old stuff. Then that new person comes in, spends 3 years out in the field going around everywhere. Now I know why Temple always talks about the same stuff, because she gets frustrated. She's gone around to all these facilities that her company owns, and she's like, "Go back there and fix the same stuff."
Absolutely.
We still always have to talk about basics.
There's a slip. There's and you become used to seeing things.
It flips. It's like the speeding would gradually increase.
Yeah.
And I think traffic rules and stuff is a good way to look at it, because can you imagine if the police just stopped monitoring for drunk driving? Well, we'd have car crashes all over the place.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a human nature thing, a psychology thing there. I'm getting still some more questions about leader cows, and we're fine for time. We're fine for time for a moment.
I've got another 10 minutes, and I can stay a little longer if you want.
No, well, we will aim to, we'll finish at 8:30, but we'll just have another few more questions, and then so leader and dominant cows. I've got one person who is sending their leader cow, the cow they believe is their leader cow, away, and presumably the herd will then, another one will establish itself as the new leader.
Yeah, they will. They'll establish a new leader. That may take some time. You see, the thing that a lot of people find surprising is that the leader is usually not the dominant cow at the feed trough.
Right. No, so I remember. So you said that a moment ago, and when you were talking about that, it appeared like they're the same cow all the time. And
well, they are. And when we first got numerical ear tags, when they first started getting them, and a rancher go out and buy 200 ear tags numbered like 1, 2, 3, 4 sequential numbered ear tags. They were really shocked that when the cows came back the next year, they were almost in the same order coming through the handling chute for vaccinations, because they put these sequential numbered ear tags in. And I had several ranchers say that they were just shocked that they were almost in the same order.
No, that's so it doesn't change. So even if groups change, that leader cow will always.
If you put enough new cattle in there, that's going to change things. And another animal, but it's the high seek, likes to explore, kind of bold. That's the one that oftentimes will lead. And you'll notice I've done a lot of aerial flights over different parts of the U.S. and even in Ireland. Cows make those little paths where the little paths about this wide. They need to walk in single file down these little paths.
I see. I see. No, that's
This is a
brilliant.
tractor, yeah, and you go over a small plane and you can see that.
Um, I've got loads of questions coming in. Goodness
I'll have
temple.
to pick them
But
out because I can't see the chat.
no, that's it. No, no. Well, you're best not to. It's a busy place. I've
Okay.
got so there's another question here about enrichment, and I think it's important we cover this.
All right, let's do.
I know some people who put balls up for calves and the like, and you've already spoken about cow brushes. What would is there anything else you would recommend as positive enrichment for either calves or cows?
They like long hay, the long stuff. And one of the problems we've got right now with some of our beef feedlots is they're chopping the hay up like this, like that bad. And we're having some very bad liver problems. And they're doing it to get feed conversion. But we've also selecting more and more and more for meat. So we've had some leg problems. We're getting congestive heart failure. And this is just pushing the biology too hard.
Yes.
And the liver abscesses have got some of the liver problems are out of control now.
No, I see. I see. No, well, I think it is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? It's
well, you see, what happens is they're doing that to reduce the amount of improve the feed ratio.
yes.
You know, but you see, the same issue has come up in chickens. Well, at what point have you pushed this system too far? And in chickens, they've learned they got to back off a little bit. Now, going back to slow growing chickens and increase your feed 20%, that's not very good from a sustainability standpoint. But with some of these cattle, you're really starting to get into some problems. I mean, if you have an animal that dies a week before slaughter, he's got zero weight gain.
No, absolutely.
That's not very, very efficient. And I think what's happened, it's bad becoming normal. It's just like the lameness creeping up, or traffic if you were not, monitoring for speed. It happens slowly. It's the same things happen with the bulldog. We bred for more and more of a big head, smashed in face. Now they can't walk, can't breathe. Even after they do the surgery, they still can't breathe. That's bad becoming normal. And it creeps up slowly, and you don't realize the mess you're kind of getting in. And beef cattle have got some issues now that 20 years ago would have never have dreamed it would be a problem. You know, when I see an animal welfare issue right now at a meat packing plant, it's something I have to fix at the farm. They didn't get lame on the truck. Don't blame the truckers for this.
No.
They didn't cause it. It has to be corrected at the farm, and some of it's genetics, and some of it is how they're fed, and growth promotants going overboard with that.
There's another question that I'll perhaps make my last question, I think, because I've got one or two things just to say at the end. When I watched the film, I think it was your film about your life. There was a moment in it where your family were using a squeeze crush for cows. Is that something that you feel is a definite positive for using with cattle? Does it genuinely have an effect?
Well, I think yes, it does. And now lots of times dairy cows are so tame you don't need to. But beef cattle that aren't so tame, first of all, it keeps them just flinging themselves all around. Now, I've come over to the UK where they've gotten them, and the people are really pleased with it. The other thing that movie showed is it showed how I was a visual thinker. You see, everything I think about is a picture. See, right now I'm seeing some farms that I went to in the UK on a trip. Especially for cattle that got any wildness at all, that's where the squeeze really works well. And you have to make sure that you don't throw them off balance with it. Some of the cheaper ones, just one side squeezes, and that can throw a cow off balance. And then if you've got a lot of our animals right now are really broad, the Angus are really broad. We have a squeeze crush that can pivot at the bottom and squeeze pivot at the bottom, or ones where the sides come in parallel. Now, if we would use something like this in dairy, I would get the ones where it's straight sides that move in parallel.
I see.
Because it's easier for them to walk in and out of that. Where the ones that are V'd at the bottom, it's harder for them to walk in and out of that.
No, it was the one thing that struck me about that the film. There was the effect that it was having on those ranch cattle. So
well, and they you know, if you got completely tamed dairy cattle, and you've got to put a non-slip floor in there, because you'll get these little slips like this, and they are absolutely getting completely scared. And you'll watch one of the feet, and it'll just be going like this. I've seen that on single animal scales too, and the animal is just completely scared. And then you just put one thing in there to stop that little side slip like this, they calm right down.
No,
but
that's
I think
it.
for a lot of your situation, you can get the ones where the sides stay straight. We use a lot of the V-shaped ones, but we still get quite a lot of very wild cattle coming in. And one issue that we've had, and this is not good, is we've had some grass people grow a steer up to 3 years old and never handle it. And then it's a wild animal and you've got to bring it into market. And that's a big mess. You know, you need to have people walking out amongst cattle on the pasture and get them used to people on the pasture. Then another problem we've had has been, we have cattle on western ranches where they only worked on a horse and they're really nice and calm. And then when they see the first person on foot, they take off.
Course.
The flight zone will go from 2 meters to 20 meters when they see the person, because a person on a horse looks totally different than a person on the ground.
Absolutely. I think I know there's so much more that we could talk about this evening, and I think I'm afraid time has beaten us, and I'm going to have to pull some of these questions to a close. So it's been really interesting, Temple. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been such an amazing insight. And please, could I just remind all dairy farmers about the focus group that Temple's mentioned Miriam tonight. Miriam Parker is going to be delivering with us. These are 30 people groups. It's going to be delivered online, and it's the 24th of February, 11:30 till 1:30. And those, if you're watching this, take a picture of this slide if you can. Those are the details to sign up. If you're a beef farmer, you can let us know. You email in the same way or phone call, and we'll aim to try and accommodate you where we possibly can. If you've got any questions related to today, we're keen to hear those. We'll try to answer as many as we possibly can after today, but we're really keen for your feedback too. There's 2 more webinars in this series. The next 2 webinars are live only. You are going to miss out. They're not being recorded if you don't listen live. We've got Neil Chesterton from New Zealand, from Lame Cow in New Zealand, on the 16th of February. That's next week. It's exactly the same time slot. And Jurp Driesen from Cow Signals in the Netherlands on the 2nd of March. In a moment, when the webinar ends, there will be feedback form at the end, so please do fill it in and let us know what your thoughts are for this evening, and let us know what more you would like to see. Thank you, Temple, once again. It's been a fantastic insight. I've really enjoyed working with you on this. And thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us. And,
well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to everybody.
Thank you, and goodbye. I'll phone you in a moment. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, bye.